Continuing reading The Great Wheel by Robert Lawson. Chapter 10. Here's what the fair's looking like. The flowers that bloom in the spring trarlar, sang Scrimer as they picked their way across the fairgrounds the next day. There was reason for song, for all unnoticed, spring had crept upon them. The wandering breeze from the southwest was positively balmy, laden with vague scents of barns and cattle, wet earth and melting snow. Like ants called from their runs by the first mild days, workers by the thousands swarmed over the grounds. Mule-drawn scrapers, scoops, and harrows were attacking the great mounds of black prairie soil, spreading it into smoothly graded lawns. Drays laden with shrubs and plants struggled through the soft earth. Gleaming white plaster sculptures were being rolled out and placed on their foundations. The lagoons were filling with water. Scrap lumber and rubbish were burning in 100 bonfires. High above everything else rose the two towers, dominating the whole scene. They looked very different now that they were connected by the wheel's great shaft. Martin Brennan was preparing to hoist the spiders, the huge cast-iron hubs to which the spokes of the wheel would be attached. Since they were in sections that weighed but 5 tons or so, it was a comparatively easy task. A few men could do it and bolt the sections around the shaft. Kahn and the others set to unloading a long trainload of steel which had arrived during the night. This was the steel for the actual wheel, far lighter and easier to handle than the heavy tower material they had been using. The girders were mostly latticed, strong but comparatively light in weight. There were countless slender steel rods that would form the spokes, the braces, the stays of the wheel. Kahn was astonished by the slimness of the spoke rods and their length. The longest stretched out over 4 flat cars. He was a bit dismayed, too, by the number of them, especially when Uncle Patrick informed the weary crew that this was only the first installment. There would be a new shipment every week until the job was finished. 2 days later, the first section of the wheel was hung. 2 heavy 21-foot girders, which would be part of the outer rim, were laid out. To these were bolted 2 crossbeams, forming a square, hung from its corners by 4 of the long spoke rods running far up to the hub. At each corner, beside the spoke rods, were set up 4 long, 30-foot girders. The tops of these were connected by 4 lighter girders, which would form part of the inner ring. The result was an open box-like affair hanging from the hub by the 4 slender spokes. It was embraced by lighter rods running crosswise and diagonally. Each rod was fitted with turnbuckles, and when these were tightened, the cage-like box was taut, rigid, and tremendously strong. Mr. Ferris, Uncle Patrick, and Stonewall Jackson stood looking it over. "Well, there we are," Uncle Patrick said dubiously. "1 section done. Real handsome and all, but it's took us 4 days, and there's 35 more to do. 4 times 35 is 140. 140 days, 4 months and 20 days. The fair'll be over." General Jackson studied his cheroot carefully. "You are unduly pessimistic, Mr. Giblin," he drawled, smiling, "and pessimism has never been one of your failings. This first section was new to us. With experience, we shall easily cut the time to 3 days for each. And we shall build 2 sections simultaneously. You and yo crew of stalwart Hibernians may take the west half, and I and the flower of the Southland will essay the east. Thus we shall complete 2 sections every 3 days. Mr. Ferris's lightning brain will give you the result of that schedule in a moment. It is a trifle beyond my feeble mathematical powers." 52 1/2 days, Mr. Ferris said promptly, and grinned. "I had figured on 60 days, 2 months. Anything under 60 belongs to you and your men." "You are most generous, sir." The general bowed deeply. "We shall look forward with pleasure to a week or more of leisure at full pay." "But no racing," Mr. Ferris cautioned. "Both sides must proceed at exactly the same rate. The weight must be kept evenly balanced." "It will, sir. Never fear," Uncle Patrick said, greatly relieved. 3 days per section it is, and rest easy, Stonewall. We'll not keep you and your ragged-tailed rebels waiting, neither. Let us trust not, the general smiled. We shall meet again soon, at the top. The general was right. With experience, the work did go much more rapidly. Each section was merely a repetition of the last. Every rod and girder was marked and numbered. The ground crews sent them up in their exact order. Martin Brennan and his crew raised the small derricks, scaffolds, and catwalks each day to keep pace with the rising framework. It became a factory-like routine. The time for the next section was cut to 3.5 days, and from then on they averaged 3 days, sometimes even better. But it was work, the hardest sort of work. Uncle Patrick drove them unmercifully, doing at least 2 men's work himself. Con's every muscle ached. Despite the heavy leather gloves, his hands were bruised and sore. At night, he tossed and tightened bolts in his sleep. No time now for letter writing or for thinking of Wisconsin, or for letter writing or thinking of Wisconsin or cows. Luckily, the weather favored them with a succession of warm, mild days. Below them, the smoothed wastes of soil showed a green fuzz of young grass. The blue waters of Lake Michigan appeared. Soon, steamers began pushing their way through the scattered ice packs. On the flat farmlands, plowing had started. They passed the halfway mark, and now the 2 great arcs of steel began to curve inward toward their eventual meeting. This was the point at which the skeptics had predicted the wheel would collapse. But as each section was added, tightly braced and cross-braced, it became clear that the 30-foot deep rim was merely a curved truss bridge, perfectly capable of supporting itself regardless of spokes. The height at which they now worked was awesome, considerably higher than a 22-story building. Had he not worked up to it with it gradually, Con might have found it terrifying. As it was, he gave it no thought. He was too busy. One day, though, as he and Pop Jenks ate their lunch, seated on a cross girder some 240 feet above the ground, he remembered with amusement Uncle Patrick's words that first time he had seen him in New York. Real men, with the heart to do their work at dizzying heights and eat their lunches sitting on a girder no bigger than your 2 hands with nothing below them but the empty air and maybe a stray seagull or 2. Well, here he was doing just that. Uncle Patrick was as good a prophet as Aunt Honora. It must run in the family. Here's a picture of him eating lunch. Finishing his lunch, he tossed away a scrap of bread and smiled again as a wandering gull from the lake darted through the maze of rods and snatched the morsel in midair. Each day, the tips of the great curving crescent grew closer. Now the rival crews could easily exchange jeers and insults across the narrowing gap. They were cheery insults, though, for they had cut their estimated time by a day and a half. At their present rate of progress, 9 full days of rest with pay awaited them. At last came the day that saw the gap only 1 section wide. Excitement ran high, for there had been much speculation as to whether the last section would fit. Many had contended the great unsupported weight would have caused some sag or bending of the 2 arcs. There had been endless argument and a good number of bets placed. Uncle Patrick had accepted any and all bets. "Mr. Ferris has planned it," he said grandly, "and it will fit as snug as a hard-boiled egg fits in its shell." The last 2 outer girders would be hoisted up simultaneously. Perched on an upper corner of the last section, Con and Pop Jenks awaited the arrival of their end. On the other side of the wheel sat Uncle Patrick and another worker. Across the 20-foot gap, Stonewall Jackson stood easily on a swaying plank, his hand grasping an upright bar, the smoke and his chair root rising lazily. Around him, his tense crew waited. Slowly, their girder rose. The rival crew caught their end first and pinned it with a bolt or 2. Con, his heart pounding, reached far out, caught his end and swung it in. The holes lined up almost exactly. Driving his pointed wrench handle through, he levered the holes into perfect alignment. Pop shot through a bolt, spun the nut, and twisted it home with a grunt that was half shout. At the same instant, a roar of triumph from Uncle Patrick announced that his end was fast. Bedlam broke loose as both crews banged their wrenches on rods and girders. The donkeymen tied down their whistles. Mr. Ferris appeared, gazed at the completed circle, waved his hands, and returned to his office. Workers on the roofs of nearby buildings waved their hats and cheered. Stonewall Jackson swept off his hat in smiling salute to Uncle Patrick. Hastily, the girders of the inner circle were raised. They fitted perfectly. Both crews united in setting the remaining rods and braces, and by evening the gap was entirely filled. There was still a week or so of work, stringing more stays, tightening turnbuckles, and removing scaffolding, but it went rapidly. Came an evening when, after gathering up their lunch pails and starting for home, Uncle Patrick, Con, Martin, and his crew turned for a last look at the great wheel standing still and black against the golden sky. Every slender rod was taut and trim. The circular sweep of the two rims was clean and unbroken by derrick or scaffold. The raked legs of the two towers seemed bracing themselves against any gale. Despite the strength and massive weight they knew was there, the whole structure gave an impression of lightness and grace. Uncle Patrick seemed struck with the sudden realization. "By gory, lad," he roared, clouting Con a mighty blow on the back, "our wheel is built."